is a view from someone biking, not me, I promise, not me, through Midtown Manhattan. And this gives us a sense of what the visual system has to process. So it helps us appreciate that our environment is highly dynamic, as we've heard so much about at this meeting. And we must perceive and act in real time based on this kind of constantly changing stream of visual input. So attention is a process, a cognitive process, that helps us prioritize relevant visual information. And it's important because we have a limited neural resources with which to process all the information that's entering the eyes. So one well-studied type of attention, which many of you may be familiar with, is spatial attention. For example, even if you're keeping your eyes straight ahead on the road in front of you, you might attend to the right because you're about to change lanes into the right lane, and you want to make sure that no cars are coming. Right? So a hallmark of spatial attention is that it is selective. So selective means that when you attend to the right, you see better on the right, but it comes at a cost of seeing worse on the left, which you've been ignoring. Okay, now today I'll be talking about temporal attention for this time meeting. So we can attend to specific points in time when something important is likely to occur. So, for example, this biker biking through this busy lane of traffic should attend more right now, right at that time. You probably got already anxious right now. You need to attend now to see what that blue van is doing and avoid running into it. Okay, so this is temporal attention, the prioritization of visual information at specific points in time. And this kind of goal-directed attention to a point in time that you know in advance will be relevant for your behavioral goals is what we call voluntary temporal attention. Okay. So we've used an integrated approach to study voluntary temporal attention in which we characterize behavior, develop computational models to make our working hypotheses explicit and formal, and then use these models to make new predictions about brain activity, which we then test with experiments. And I'm going to take you through this kind of full cycle in the talk today. And so in the first part of the talk, I'll introduce the sort of core behavioral phenomenon of selective voluntary temporal attention, and I'll show you how we modeled that. And then the rest of the talk will focus on the neural mechanisms of temporal attention that we've recently been working to uncover. And in this work, we're really building on research by people like Kia Nobre and many others who, about how humans and other animals exploit many different sources of predictive temporal information in the environment to improve behavior. And we've heard about many of these ideas already at this meeting. At the same time, although temporal attention is, I would say, a growing field of research, we still know much less about voluntary temporal attention than we do about other types of attention, like spatial attention or feature-based attention to things like visual features like orientation or different colors. And in a way, time is a very different kind of dimension in terms of the brain than space and features, which are all represented nicely on the cortical surface, right? Time is not represented nicely on the cortical surface. So we have to start thinking about different kinds of mechanisms for how the brain may allocate attention across time compared to how it allocates attention to spatial locations or different kinds of visual features. And it's still rather unclear whether temporal attention and other kinds of attention really have common or distinct mechanisms. Okay, so the first question we asked when we were getting started with this research was, is voluntary attention selective in time just as it is in space? Okay, and by that I mean selectivity in time will imply trade-offs. Selectivity implies trade-offs. Here, not across space, but across time. So that would look like this. If you have two stimuli, let's call them T1, the first stimulus, and T2, the second stimulus. Let's say these are two stimuli appearing sequentially in the same spatial location. And if you know in advance that T1 is important for your task, you might attend at that time, T1, and experience an attentional benefit at T1. But if attention is selective in time, that benefit for T1 should now come at a cost later in time at T2. Okay. And also vice versa. So if you expect something important for your task to happen at T2, you should attend to T2, get this attentional benefit for T2. But if attention is selective in time, this should also now come at a cost now earlier in time at T1. Okay, and this is what we're going to call the perceptual trade-offs hypothesis, trade-offs across time. Alternatively, okay, if there are only two stimuli, just one after the other in the same location, why can't you just sustain attention across that time period at a maximum level for both? Then attending to one point in time does not imply less attention available at another point in time. And this is what we'll call the sustained attention hypothesis. Okay, so to test for selectivity, we developed a new task. This is a 2-target temporal pre-cueing task in which participants are instructed in advance to attend to a particular time point. Now, I'm going to take some time to walk through this task because I'm going to be coming back to it many times throughout this talk. So please, if you have any clarification questions about this task, please feel free to ask them now to make sure we're all on the same page there. Okay, so on each trial of this task, we have 2 targets, T1 and T2, presented in the same spatial location, separated by a short time interval. I'm, again, a vision scientist, so here we have our beautiful Gabors. And the observer's task here is to discriminate the orientation, slight clockwise or counterclockwise tilt of one of these Gabors, which they're asked to report by a response cue at the end of the trial. So the response cue at the end tells them to report the clockwise or counterclockwise tilt of either T1 or T2. Now, we manipulate temporal attention trial by trial using a pre-cue at the beginning of a trial. That pre-cue is a tone. High tone says attend to T1. Low tone says attend to T2. And then sometimes both tones occur, so those are neutral trials, which say just try to attend to both T1 and T2. This pre-cue is 75% valid, meaning that 75% of the time, when observers are instructed to attend to T1, they're asked to report the orientation of T1. Those are valid attention trials. And then the other 25% of the trials, they say, whoops, please report the orientation of the other target, T2. So those are invalid attention trials. Okay, and then on these neutral trials, participants are equally likely to be asked about T1 or T2, so the pre-cue is uninformative with respect to the timing of the task-relevant target. Okay, so behaviorally, oh, yes, please.
Just on the pre-cue, so is it explicit that they're told beforehand this one type of beam means attend T1, or do they have to learn this implicitly?
Good question, yes, this is all explicit. Okay. Yes, so they know what the meaning of the cue is, and they know that if it is helpful to them, they should use it. Good. Any other question before I go on? Okay. Okay, so behaviorally we find that temporal attention improves discrimination performance on this task. So accuracy is highest for valid trials, intermediate for neutral trials, and lowest for invalid trials. This is for T1. We see a similar pattern for T2. Here's combining both targets together, T1 and T2, and we see both significant benefits for valid trials compared to neutral trials, as well as costs for invalid trials, worse than neutral trials. Okay, so we've also replicated this basic finding many times now, and other labs have also replicated in beautiful contrast response functions here. So these bidirectional trade-offs are quite robust, And I want to emphasize that in these kind of tests, there are only 2 targets. They occur at predictable times, one after the other. There are no distractors. There are no masks. So if observers would be able to just sustain attention and process both of these targets maximally, they really should be able to do that under these conditions. But the fact that we see these benefits and costs for attending to the right time or not attending to the wrong time really tell us that this process of attending to points in time is a selective process in time, just as similar to what we see across space. So the next question we asked here is, how long do these trade-offs last, right? Surely if you attend today and then attend tomorrow, like that will be fine, right? How long do these trade-offs last? So to do that, we varied the SOA, or the stimulus onset asynchrony, that time interval between the first target and the second target. And we measured the effect of temporal attention at each interval. So the top row here is performance, D prime, on this discrimination task. We see valid in blue, neutral in gray, invalid in red. And once again, we see performance is better for valid trials than invalid trials for both targets. That's quantified down here in the queuing effect. So this is valid minus invalid. And what we can see is that these trade-offs have a time course, right? So they peak their maximum level at around 250 milliseconds for both T1 and T2, and they drop off at shorter and longer SOAs, and they're pretty much gone by the time we get to 800 milliseconds. Okay, so there's a very specific time scale of hundreds of milliseconds over which these trade-offs are operating. And so what I want to do now is tell you that we've developed a computational model, right? We said, how can we explain these trade-offs and how they happen on this time scale? Of course, in the time domain, you also have many other processes that are happening, masking, and so on and so forth, right? So we need to somehow be able to separate these different dynamic processes from each other to understand what are the dynamics of attention per se. So we developed this model, a normalization model of dynamic attention, that accounts for these data. So I want to take a few minutes right now just to give you an idea of how this model works and how it can explain these rather complex dynamics that we see both in overall performance and in the attentional dynamics. And first, just to say that I would argue as a field, we really need more development of dynamic attention models. So some existing attention models describe how spatial and feature-based attention affect neural responses and behavior, but lack dynamics, right? Just static models. And this is especially the case in the visual domain, where a lot of what we do is how do we see an image, right? A still image. There are some models that have dynamic components, maybe for sensory processing, but don't specify attentional dynamics. And then there are a couple of models that describe attentional dynamics that are triggered by the appearance of a task-relevant stimulus, but not anticipatory dynamics in cases when you can actually predict when a relevant stimulus will appear, right? So at the time we did this work, there was actually no model of voluntary attention to specific time points. So we developed a computational framework that addresses these gaps while also retaining generality to capture spatial and feature-based attention. And we based our model on a successful model of spatial and feature-based attention, which is the Reynolds and Heeger normalization model of attention. Some of you may be familiar with it, but in case not, let me walk through it. So normalization, first of all, is a kind of contextual modulation, specifically divisive suppression, that has been described as a canonical neural computation because it's very widespread in sensory and cognitive systems and circuits. So this Reynolds and Heeger model describes how the response of a given orientation to neuron, let's say this yellow neuron here, is enhanced by its bottom-up input and also by top-down attentional gain, and is suppressed or normalized by the activity of its neighbors, so all these surrounding gray neurons here who are tuned to slightly different features in that local neural neighborhood. Okay, so this is the simple normalization equation. It makes a lot of successful predictions, both behaviorally and neurophysiologically. But you can see this is a static model. There's no time here, there's no t anywhere in these equations. Okay, so it cannot help us with temporal attention or with the dynamics of other types of attention. So here we introduce dynamics by formulating the model as a differential equation, which is updated at every time step by this same normalization equation. Now, in the steady state, that means that this model will produce the same behavior as the static model. So that's good. So it's going to generalize to this everything that this previous model can do, this new model can do. But now we have this extra dimension of time. And what should we do with that? Okay, so our full dynamic model is this rather simple recurrent neural network with sensory layers, attention layers, and a decision layer that reads out the signals from the sensory layer to form a clockwise or counterclockwise decision about orientation, just like our human participants. And all of these layers are running the same computation I just described, the same equations. The only difference is what are the inputs and what are the outputs, okay? And now the key question is, if we look at a model like this, we run the recurrent model, it's going to produce these simulated time series in response to a stimulus like the one we have in our task. Okay, and the big question we have is, okay, what should the dynamics of these attention layers be, right? What are the dynamics of attentional gain? And we find that we can fit this dynamic normalization model to the data by simulating the neural responses to different trial sequences and using the clockwise or counterclockwise decisions output by the model to calculate the model's d prime. And the curves here actually show the model fit to the data. So the data are in the data points here. The curves show the model fit. Sorry, the error bars on the model are a little bit faded. But we found that this model was able to capture both the overall dynamics of performance as well as the dynamics of the attentional cueing effect here. Okay, and now we can examine the voluntary attentional dynamics the model used to capture the behavior. And what we found is that to fit the model, to fit the data, the model needed a temporal limit on the availability of attentional gain, of voluntary attentional gain. So let me take you through that. So I think it's a familiar idea that at a given moment in time, there's some attentional resource of some kind or another that is limited. In our model, we made this resource concrete by simply letting it be the amount of available voluntary attentional gain. And we generalized this limited resources idea to the time domain by saying, okay, if you use all of this gain at one moment, at the next moment, you don't have it all back again right away, but rather it takes some time to recover. And we call this recovery time TR. So then let's look at how voluntary attention will be allocated at 3 points in this recovery period. So when the SOA is short, voluntary gain recovers very little between T1 and T2. So the system allocates the available gain based on the cue. If you're cued to T1, you allocate the bulk of your gain to T1, and then you only have a little bit of left over for T2. Vice versa if the cue is T2. If the cue is neutral, you can try to allocate equally between T1 and T2, for example. But when the SOA is longer, there's more gain to go around. So you can allocate more gain to the uncued target, and these trade-offs become less severe. And when the when the SOA is at a TR or longer, now you can allocate maximal gain to both targets because the gain has fully recovered by that time. And there are no more trade-offs. And in the fitted model, when we fitted this model to our data, the estimated recovery time was a bit less than 1 second. Now, importantly, when we remove this limit on voluntary attention and the model can allocate maximal gain to any cued target regardless of the SOA, the model fails qualitatively in these 2 ways. First of all, there's no more selectivity. So I don't know if you can see it well here, but neutral performance in gray is just as good as valid performance for both T1 and T2 in this model without limits. And that's very different from what we see in the data, where you get impairments in the neutral condition. And secondly, we see this persistent queuing effects at long SOAs, which are simply not present in the data. And so, of course, quantitatively, the model with the limits on voluntary attentional gain, it performs much better than this model without limits. And so, at a conceptual level, the behavioral data we have and this model implementation both suggest that the brain has limited resources of some kind for processing information across time over this time scale of hundreds of milliseconds. And as we've seen many times in this meeting, this is an important time scale for much of cognition and behavior. And I'm sort of cartooning this concept here with a metaphor of a glass of water, which is meant to illustrate that rather than what we often think about as this kind of static notion of limited resources, like how much can the brain do at one moment in time, which often we think about that's something that creates competition between simultaneously presented stimuli and so on. We really should think about the dynamics of resource use and resource recovery. So again, at a very abstract level, if you pour out this water from the glass, it's going to take some time for that glass to be refilled. And in the version of the normalization model I just showed you, the hypothesized resource was attentional gain. But there are other possibilities. There are various other possibilities, some of which we're working on now in a modeling context. So, to really understand, of course, what mechanisms underlie temporal attention and what mechanisms underlie these constraints in temporal processing that make it useful to attend to points in time in the first place, we really need to go to the brain. And that is what we have been doing in the past few years in my lab. Asking, in terms of neural mechanisms, how do we attend to anticipated points in time? And why can't we just sustain perception and attention across time, across these hundreds of millisecond time intervals? Okay, so here we're moving on to the brain. So first I want to make this point that to uncover the neural mechanisms of temporal attention, we need to isolate temporal attention from a related, but I would argue, and others before me have argued, distinct concept of temporal expectation. So in general, expectation is based on predictability in this taxonomy. So what is the likelihood of something happening at a particular moment? Whereas attention is based on relevance. So what is the importance of that moment to my current task? So for example, let's say you have a commute through that crazy Times Square Manhattan bike ride, and let's say you pass by this Red Lobster every day on your route to work. So you can very well predict when that Red Lobster is going to appear. But you've never gone to Red Lobster? You never intend to go to Red Lobster? I think now Red Lobster is bankrupt, right? It's bankrupt. It just went bankrupt. You can't go, okay? So Red Lobster is completely irrelevant for any of your tasks. And so, the relevance of this moment is low, even though the predictability is very high, right? On the other hand, the moment when you pass the blue van is very predictable because you can see it coming and you can estimate, when you're going to reach that blue van based on your trajectory and its trajectory. It is also high relevance because it's in, potentially in your lane of traffic. So for any given time point, we can quantify two probabilities. One is the probability that any stimulus will appear. Let's call that timing predictability. And then a separate probability that some task-relevant stimulus will appear. So that would be time point relevance. Now, in the time domain, predictability and relevance often go together. As many of our everyday tasks, they go together. And so a relevant stimuli like the blue van might appear with more or less predictable timing. And most of what we know about the neural mechanisms of temporal attention, I'm listing just a few references here, come from studies that have manipulated these two variables in tandem. So manipulated the relevance of a time point by manipulating how predictable something is going to be. So to isolate temporal attention from temporal expectation, we need to manipulate relevance while controlling predictability. So this will be like comparing the predictable appearance of the blue van to the predictable appearance of red lobster. Okay. And this comparison is actually exactly what this two-target temporal cueing task achieves. Okay, both targets are always perfectly predictable. They always appear at the same times after this pre-cue. It's simply the relevance of each one of those time points that's manipulated trial by trial according to the identity of the pre-cue. Okay, so we use this approach now to investigate the dynamic neural mechanisms of temporal attention using MEG. And in two matched studies here, we asked first, how does the brain prepare to select a task-relevant stimulus at a specific moment? So what are these anticipatory dynamics that might happen to prepare the brain to attend at a moment in time? And then how does temporal attention affect the representational dynamics of a selected stimulus after that stimulus appears? The analysis for these first projects were led by a graduate student in my lab, Karen Tian. And going into this project, in the literature, there are at least two major neural correlates of anticipating predictable stimuli. One of them is ramping. A lot of the ramping activity that we might see in the literature is coming in motor, kind of reaction time tasks where we're preparing to make a movement. We see these ramping signals. But there's also at least one study showing a signature of ramping in gamma power in primary visual cortex, V1. So we know that this is also possibly a sensory mechanism. The second kind of broad class of mechanisms will be these oscillations. And it's particularly several observations show that in this delta band, now maybe we could really identify that, and again, I've used this arbitrary time range. So delta band modulation in anticipation of both rhythmic stimuli and also cued stimuli. So the rhythmic stimuli, it's a little bit hard to interpret because there may be a rhythmic entrainment to these stimuli that are often presented in these kind of delta frequencies in these studies. But there's at least one or two studies with a kind of cued interval where there's no rhythmic stimulation, so no entrainment, and still seeing some evidence for delta power leading up to those expected times. Okay, so we're on the lookout for these types of signatures, and here we're asking, are these types of mechanisms really contributing only to temporal prediction, like the predicting that something's going to happen, or do they also contribute to temporal attention once predictability has been controlled? So to answer this question, we use the same two-target temporal cueing task to manipulate temporal attention while controlling temporal expectation or predictability. And here our goal was to uncover any anticipatory top-down modulation of visual cortex leading up to the target time. Now, in order to do that, we have to probe the visual cortex continuously during this anticipatory period in order to be in a position to measure any, for example, top-down gain modulations on that cortex. And so to do this, we drove the visual cortex continuously using a flickering noise patch. So we used this SSVER, steady-state visual evoked response approach. We presented a flickering noise patch continuously throughout the trial. And then we measured the steady-state visual evoked response, SSVER, in a time-resolved fashion throughout the trial. Now the grading targets, so same two-target cueing task as before, are now embedded in this flickering noise, okay? So here's what this looked like, a little bit slowed down. Okay, so you're fixating at the center of the screen, and here comes the stimulus, flicker, 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 flicker. Okay, T1, T2, flicker, flicker, flicker. Okay, so now we can continuously probe the state of the visual cortex all through this anticipatory period and measure the dynamics. First, of course, we want to confirm that we still see our behavior. So temporal attention, again, it improved discrimination d prime for valid trials compared to invalid trials. So now we're in a position to see what happens to the anticipatory activity. And once again, this SSVER probe allows this continuous time-resolved tracking of visual cortical modulations during the anticipatory pre-target period. And to quantify these modulations, we use intertrial phase coherence, or ITPC, from visually responsive channels. So here are the visually responsive channels we measured. As expected, they're in these posterior locations over the occipital lobe. And the way this works is we have our stimulus flicker going at 20 hertz, right? So flick, 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 20 hertz. If a neural population is tracking the stimulus flicker, it should have a periodic response that is in phase with the flicker, and that is highly consistent across trials because it's following that flicker across every trial. This will give rise to a high level of this measure, ITPC, at 20 hertz, at the 20 hertz stimulus frequency, okay? On the other hand, if we have a channel that's not very responsive to the flicker, it should, respond fairly randomly, not in any way phase locked to the stimulus flicker. And so from trial to trial, these are going to be, not well aligned at all. And so this will have a low ITPC. Okay, so this is a way that we can use this measure, ITPC, to track how well each channel is following the flickering stimulus in a time-resolved fashion. Because this is very fast, this is 20 hertz. So we have pretty good resolution, around 100, we can resolve this at a time scale of around 100 milliseconds. And indeed, when we see the time frequency spectrum of this ITPC measure, there's a very strong 20 hertz response to the stimulus, as we would expect. So this is a very high SNR measure. Okay, so now let's look at these anticipatory modulations of visual cortical responses. So here I'm plotting the 20 hertz ITPC at the stimulus frequency across time. So here is the pre-Q onset. Here's the onset of T1. Here's the onset of T2. And the anticipatory period is indicated here with this gray bar. And our first observation was that just thinking about temporal expectation, so this is across all trials now, the ITPC steadily increased during this anticipatory period. So this is an overall effect of temporal expectation for these upcoming predictably timed targets. And we characterized this ramping behavior using a linear fit to the data and found a positive slope across observers. So this is this very reliable ramping effect leading up to the predictable target times. We also found evidence for periodic modulations of ITPC during this anticipatory period, which was most prominent at delta frequencies around 2 hertz. This is fit to the group data for visualization. And this delta band modulation was consistent across all trials and also across both pre-Q conditions separately. So now we can ask, what is the effect of temporal attention on these anticipatory signatures over and above temporal expectation? And what we found is that temporal attention actually shifts the phase of this delta modulation by about half a cycle. So here is this anticipatory time series again, now split by attention condition. So blue is pre-QT1, red is pre-QT2. And we can see that these time series are now roughly in antiphase. And we quantified this phase shift for individual observers, shown in this histogram here. And you can see there's an average phase shift of 218 milliseconds. And this value is interesting because it's similar to the 300 millisecond interval between the two targets. It's also similar to the 250 millisecond interval that behaviorally we find leads to the peak temporal attentional trade-offs, the largest temporal attention effects measured behaviorally. Okay, so to summarize this section, using SSVER to continuously probe visual cortical responses before anticipated stimuli, we see that first, temporal expectation of predictable targets was associated with, first of all, a slow ramping increase in visual cortical responses, as well as a periodic modulation of visual cortical responses in the delta band. Now I want to emphasize that these are not simply fluctuations in like the voltage or of the EEG or power of the MEG, etc. This is actually a periodic and a ramping modulation of the responsiveness of the visual cortex. So this is more like a top-down, maybe something like a gain modulation that we're measuring here. So over and above this effect of temporal expectation, we also see that temporal attention shifted the phase of this delta modulation by about half a cycle. And we propose that this phase shift of these top-down periodic modulations may mediate trade-offs between sequential stimuli. Okay, so in the next study, we're moving from the pre-target period to now the post-target period, asking how does temporal attention affect the representational dynamics of a selected stimulus? And this work was led by Jiating Zhu, a graduate student in my lab, along with Karen Tian. Okay, now when we went into this study, we had some pretty strong hypotheses based on work on spatial attention, feature-based attention, as well as just like temporal expectation, temporal predictability, which all of these studies have observed increased visual evoked responses at pretty early time points, around 100 milliseconds, sometimes even earlier for both spatial feature-based attention, as well as a couple of observations similar to that for temporal expectation of a predictable target. So we expected something, to see something like this, early changes in the visual evoked responses. But what we actually found was something a little more interesting, which I will show you. So, okay, the goal of this study was again to measure the impact of temporal attention on time-varying representations of each stimulus after it appears. So again, we're using exactly the same two-target cueing task. Now there's without SSVR, so no flicker here, just pure targets, to obtain clean measures of the neural responses to each stimulus. Once again, we confirmed that temporal attention improved orientation, discrimination, performance in this task with higher perceptual sensitivity for valid versus invalid trials. And so now we can look at the neural data. And the first thing we saw, which we were quite surprised, is that we really found no evidence that temporal attention changes this early visual evoked response once expectation is controlled. So here we're looking at visual evoked responses from the top 5 visually responsive channels. Sorry for the contrast. And you can see there's just no difference. There's no discernible difference between pre-QT1 trials and pre-QT2 trials. Of course, there's a clear response to each target, so we're getting very robust visual evoked responses, but simply no difference between the attention conditions. And indeed, we found no effect of the pre-Q on evoked response amplitude, or also on evoked response latency for any number of channels that we selected. We looked in source space using MEG. No, nothing. So far, we have not seen any evidence for this. So next, we asked, okay, let's look at something maybe more meaningful about the representation of the stimulus. Let's look at the stimulus-specific representations across time using a multivariate decoding measure. So importantly, in our task, these stimuli were tilted clockwise or counterclockwise about either the vertical axis or the horizontal axis. And this was deliberate. This allowed us to now decode vertical versus horizontal to get a measure of the sensory representation of the stimulus that's completely independent from the participant's clockwise or counterclockwise response. Okay, so that's what we're going to use for decoding this vertical versus horizontal orientation of the stimulus. And as expected from previous work, we found robust decoding of both targets. So here I'm plotting the decoding accuracy across time for T1. Here's the onset of T1 and the onset of T2. And then for T2, the onset of T2. And we see clear above chance decoding that has a similar magnitude for both T1 and T2. So now what is the effect of temporal attention on this stimulus representation? So here I'm plotting T1 decoding accuracy across time, now separated by the different attention conditions. So this is T1 attended in yellow, T1 unattended in purple. And again, some contrast is washed out, but what we can see is that temporal attention actually enhances the representation of the first target at this somewhat later time window. So there's a significant cluster here around 235 to 300 milliseconds after the onset of T1, which is also just before the onset of T2, the appearance of the second target. Now, again, this is later than what we expected based on studies of spatial and feature-based attention, as well as temporal expectation, which all have found these earlier changes and also earlier changes just in the visual evoked responses. We also found no increases in decoding accuracy with temporal attention for T2, suggesting that there may be a temporal asymmetry in the selection mechanisms for the first versus the second target. Now again, this is something that would be very surprising in a sort of spatial attention context, where space is this kind of symmetric dimension. But in time, it may not be that surprising to have different selection mechanisms as you have the first target where something's happening after versus the second target where something happened before but nothing's happening after. Okay, so what we see here is specific to T1. We replicated this pattern, this same exact thing, enhancement around 250 milliseconds for T1, nothing for T2, in a second entirely separate data set. Okay, so we think this is pretty robust. And especially given that the timing of this attentional enhancement for T1 was later than we expected, we next asked, where in the brain does this come from? Unfortunately, with MEG data, we have some traction on this. So we took advantage of the possibility of source reconstruction with MEG data to answer this question by decoding from source space during the significant time window. And first, we just established that the topography of the overall orientation decoding accuracy was what we would expect, which is highest in occipital and parietal regions in this significant time window. So that's just a good sanity check on the source reconstruction methods. And then next, we compared decoding performance in attended versus unattended trials. And to our surprise, we found that the strongest effect of temporal attention on this stimulus representation was actually localized to left frontocingulate cortex. So we found this significant cluster, which is indicated by these white circles here, the significant cluster wrapping around the lateral to the medial surface, that was strongly left lateralized. So you can see here, there's just nothing over here in the right hemisphere. And you can see that the topography of this attention effect focused on these anterior regions is very different from the topography of the overall decoding performance, which is highest in posterior regions, as we might expect. So we scratched our head and we said, okay, why left frontocingulate? Okay, and here are just a few thoughts, and of course, always happy to hear other thoughts that you may have about this. So first of all, this left lateralization may well be consistent with previous studies showing that temporal attention tends to recruit more left lateralized frontoparietal regions compared to spatial attention. So this is from fMRI or PET studies that compared temporal attention to spatial attention, found these kind of univariate enhancements in these frontoparietal regions. But it wasn't known before that the stimulus information was actually being sent to these anterior regions. I think most people would have thought this may be a control signal for temporal attention, and that might also be true. There might be a control element there, but here we're very clearly seeing that the stimulus representation is being sent to these anterior regions, and it's highly left lateralized. Second of all, this frontocingulate cluster overlaps substantially with the cingulo-opercular network, which has been associated with selecting a cued item in working memory and reformatting it into an action-oriented representation, with flexibly affiliating with other networks depending on task demands. So it's a very interesting part of the brain where we might think of representations that are, that this frontocingulate area may be getting recruited to do some sort of further transformation on the stimulus. Obviously, this is all very speculative, and we need to find ways to test this idea. But our working hypothesis and really question going forward is, could sending target information to these anterior brain regions be a mechanism for protecting information about the first target from being overwritten by the second target in visual cortex when it appears? So for example, if we have T1 represented in visual cortex, maybe it's sent up here to these anterior regions just in time for T2 to appear, so that representation may be protected for further processing when it's attended. This is our current working hypothesis. Okay, so to summarize here, temporal attention impacts the spatiotemporal dynamics of neural representations. We see enhanced representation of the first target's orientation at this intermediate processing stage around 250 milliseconds just before the second target. It's localized to the left frontocingulate cortex. And we have this idea that temporal attention may send target information to protect it from interference in visual cortex by a subsequent stimulus. Okay, so to summarize here, we see that voluntary temporal attention, first of all, trades off its effects on perception across time, and that can be captured by this general computational framework for dynamic attention that we're actively developing. In anticipation of a predictable stimulus, visual cortical responses are modulated periodically at a delta frequency, which also seems to shift in phase depending on the timing, the precise timing of attention. And finally, temporally attended stimulus information is routed to frontocingulate cortex before the onset of a temporal competitor. And so, at a behavioral level, what this gives us is, first of all, these kind of common behavioral trade-offs across temporal and other types of attention. But these, at the level of the brain, we're finding more specialized neural mechanisms for temporal attentional selection as distinct from mechanisms that we might have seen for spatial attention, for example, which may reflect the special demands of dynamic sequential processing. And so going back to this three-pronged approach, this is kind of how the results I just showed you fit in to this understanding that we're slowly building of dynamic attention, and particularly the selective aspects of temporal attention. To move toward a more mechanistic understanding of how perception and attention unfold across time, so we can actually do this, despite the very real temporal constraints we have on visual processing. So I'd like to thank the people who contributed to these projects in bold, and thanks so much for your attention.